The content presented in Cheshire Corners is for educational and informational purposes only. Please consult a legal professional if you have any questions or concerns about the content of this disclaimer, this series, or the legal implications surrounding psychedelic substances in your jurisdiction.
My name is Travis Tyler Fluke. Welcome to Cheshire Corners. I'll be your host today as we trip through the looking glass. I never fancied myself an activist. Most of my life I've just been in opposition to the way things are. And not always knowing where the most constructive place to put my criticisms or my actions that usually ended with me getting in trouble periodically, legal trouble. When I joined the campaign had already been going on for months. And my wife at the time had been involved with the campaign for 2 or 3 months at that point. And we had this daily conversation, and she would say to me, "You're Mr. Mushroom, why aren't you involved in this?" And again, I just didn't fancy myself an activist, and it just didn't seem like it was anything more than just some novel thing. And the event that really sold me on getting involved as an activist, I was at a psilocybin for palliative care talk, and this woman, before she started the talk, got up in front of everyone and told the story of her first husband had not only complex PTSD, but had a terminal condition. And at the time, I guess Johns Hopkins was putting out a lot of information pointing to the fruitful studying of psilocybin and end-of-life distress. And they really wanted him to have a psilocybin experience before he transitioned. And unfortunately, they were never able to get him mushrooms so that he could have this experience. So she was dedicated to making sure that that never happened again. And after I heard that story, I really checked in with my own kind of privilege around being able to access mushrooms and exploring with them for a long, long time in my life. I think at that point it had been 20 years at that point, maybe even a little bit more. And it really encouraged me to get involved in the conversation. And all of a sudden, this is the way I usually tell it, like I never knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. I just found myself good at a great many things, and the things that I really liked to do didn't necessarily apply themselves to a fruitful career in capitalism. And then all of a sudden, I recognized that I had all of these very unique life experiences that allowed me to really advocate for responsible mushroom use. And yeah, that's how I got involved with the campaign. And up to that point, the campaign was kind of like a bunch of people that believed that now that cannabis was legal, that mushrooms were the next place to kind of focus that dismantling the drug war kind of energy. And originally, the proto version of the campaign, the people had walked into Denver elections twice with language around an ordinance that eventually got shot down, and Denver Elections deemed that the language would not only be confusing to voters, but it couldn't be in conflict with anything else that was written. So after 2 iterations of that, some people stepped in and brought some cannabis personalities in, and they actually got a professional, like a lawyer, to write an ordinance who took sanctuary city language, and that is that Denver will not use its resources to prosecute or go after immigrants, and all they did was take that language and replace psilocybin instead of immigrants. So now the ordinance that sits right underneath the sanctuary city ordinance in the Denver, I don't even know where that law is written, but it basically says that Denver will not use its resources to go after psilocybin possession or cultivation cases. Once the language was accepted by Denver Elections, we were authorized to go out and collect signatures in support of the ordinance. And the way it goes is that you have to collect, I think it's 5% of the most recent non-presidential election turnout. So the election cycle prior to the ordinance, I think 95,000 people had come out to vote. So our obligation was to turn in 5,000 verified signatures. So a verified signature is the voter has to live in Denver City and County and actually be registered. And they have to write legibly enough so that Denver Elections can qualify their signature. And one thing that most people don't know is that there's only 26 out of 50 states where someone as a citizen can actually start this process. And we're very fortunate that in Denver that this can be done. And after I got involved with campaigning, I learned that a few years before that, there was an ordinance that actually passed to provide parking spots to UFOs. So if that tells you anything, that Denver is a place where if you have enough gumption, you can really work alongside this process to pass ordinances. And then more so than that, Denver Elections assured me multiple times that they were looking for reasons to include signatures. And I don't know if you've looked at the election landscape, but typically with voting associated shenanigans, I guess that's the way we'll put it, that people are looking for reasons to throw out votes or get rid of voters or like disqualify people from being able to get to the polls and participate, but not here. In Denver, it's actually very friendly to that. So they actually showed me that when they counted the signatures, they actually got to a higher validation rate than we were able to. So that really showed me something. So I was one of the first 4 people with a petition in hand, and this interesting thing happened. I walked into my house the day that I got my petition, and this feeling came over me that if I gave this everything, that this was possible. And it was very, very clear. And like I said, prior to that, I really was a little bit kind of hesitant to get involved, but at the end of the day, I couldn't provide my partner with a reason why not. And a few minutes ago, I told the story about being moved to become an activist. And once that sense had kind of come into my conscious awareness, then I knew that it was a matter of if and not a matter of when. So that really guided the way that I stepped up in the campaign and rallied the troops and really created an environment that was headstrong. And the campaign had these 2 distinct groups that were working alongside each other. I don't even want to say in parallel or conjunction, because it was a very like, there were two contrasting senses about how to run the campaign and what strategies to employ. So there was a group that was called the board, and the board was unable to make any decisions because we didn't have a lot of money coming into the campaign. And so the pervading sense in that group is that we can't do anything because we don't have any money. And then I would go back to the volunteers, or I should say my wife and I would go back to the volunteers, and we were constantly posing the question to the volunteer group of, well, if we don't have money and we can't get orders from the people that are supposed to be making decisions, well, like, what can we do with what we have? And in the end, that really became the pervading narrative or strategy that I see that like actually got us through. And I think that pretty much every night that at least a group of us were going out into the world and collecting signatures. And I don't think there were more than maybe 2 people that had worked on a campaign before, and it was really this sense that we were a group of rebels taking on the empire. And my wife and I couldn't pay our volunteers, so we would have volunteer meetings at the house every Friday. And I would say that on average there were about 40 people that showed up to the house every Friday. And we had this theory that if we just kept bringing people together, that people would realize that they had a community, and that the community was actually the payment for the work that we were putting in. And I oftentimes get real nostalgic for that period of time, because the whole community was oriented towards a single goal. And even though we were challenged by our opposition that we were only decriminalizing mushrooms in order to create a pathway to profiting, we just really believed that people should not be going to jail for the possession and use of a psychedelic mushroom. And in the end, we only passed by 0.5%, and it really was a testament to, show that each and every person that chipped in their own way, shape, or form really contributed to pulling the win over the line. And there were a few things that had been kind of confluential at the same time that happened right before we passed the ordinance. And one of those was Michael Pollan had written the book, How to Change Your Mind, which was kind of a baby boomer's viewpoint of having partied with the mushroom, now recognized that there is actually some potential very big benefits around working with the mushroom or isolated psilocybin, especially around mental health. The second thing that was really big at that time was the UN had passed a resolution that said that they believed that all drugs should be decriminalized. So that was working to our benefit. And then something else big happened. Oh, the FDA had granted psilocybin breakthrough therapy status. So there were these big institutions that were pointing to the fact that psilocybin wasn't nearly as bad as what we had been told. And going back to the Nixon presidency, the law was passed without any science. And they realized that people that were taking these mushrooms along with other controlled substances that they deemed to be controlled and dangerous were waking up to the fact that the war industrial complex was no good. And an interesting statistic, the day that the Controlled Substance Act was passed, there were 80 studies that were immediately halted. 80 studies in kind of like application around therapeutic use and, you know, working around mental health issues. And I thought that was pretty, kind of blew me away when I heard that 80 studies kind of immediately halted. So we went into a 50-year moratorium without any studies being able to be conducted. And it wasn't until Johns Hopkins, some of the lead researchers there, petitioned the federal government to be able to give psilocybin to the dying. So those are some things that kind of like gave us some credibility to be able to go out into the street and talk to people and give them a very short elevator pitch to get them to sign this paper that also said psilocybin. And it wasn't until we were about halfway through signature collecting that we realized that going to grocery stores was the best way to collect local signatures. And we really loved going out to concerts, especially out to Red Rocks and collecting signatures, but we realized that almost nobody lived in the city and county of Denver. So it was a great place to kind of like get used to a bunch of yeses, but at the same time, we didn't really rack up the numbers that we needed. So towards the end, we focused our efforts towards, like I said, grocery stores. And very quickly, we realized that there's a much higher percentage of voters that were coming out of grocery stores. And, you know, we knew that they were all local. So that became the kind of like best way to do that. And there was something really exciting about working on the campaign that was very contagious. And we ended up, at one point, I think we had 80 petitioners working towards that goal of 5,000 signatures. And we, along the way, we picked up a person that was a professional canvasser for Greenpeace, and we were able to kind of get some really valuable perspective on how to effectively engage people and give them the couple points that they would need to make a decision. And I think that the three of us that collected the most signatures, I think it turned out to be like that we three collected like 2,000 out of the 5,000. There was a month that it was going to take between Denver elections receiving the signatures and giving us the okay to go out and campaign. So one of my volunteers actually wrote us a computer code to be able to kind of go through all of the signatures and be able to verify them against the database with the registered voters. So it took us about, I think, 8 days, and on average we were putting in 14-hour days behind computers and sitting with all the signatures, and we actually made sure that we had enough signatures to go ahead and just start campaigning even without the say-so. And I think we validated at a percentage rate just below where Denver elections had. So it really, again, showed me that Denver elections was looking for reasons to franchise voters. And after we dropped off signatures, we started going door to door and talking to people about decriminalizing mushrooms in a way that we hadn't when we were just collecting signatures. It really kind of blew me away how hesitant people were to put their name on something that also said psilocybin, because they were really concerned that their names would end up on a list. And going door to door, we realized that that necessarily wasn't the case. And we looked at a map of when cannabis had been legalized and went to all the neighborhoods that voted the most favorably to vote for legalized cannabis, and we canvassed in those areas as a strategy. And In the end, we were able to pass the ordinance for $45,000, which comes down to 50 cents a vote, and that is almost unheard of as far as a political campaign. I think the numbers are generally like at least $3 or more a vote. And the day of the elections, 180,000 people turned out, and it was the largest non-presidential turnout in Denver elections history. And like I had said earlier, there were 95,000 people that had come out to the mayoral cycle, the previous mayoral cycle. So there was almost twice as many people. And we were on the ballot with an initiative to create a camping ban, which was actually a political move to get rid of visible poverty or the homeless. So we're pretty certain that actually drove the high numbers. And like I said, from the first day that I had a petition, I had a very clear sense that not only was this possible, but that we were going to do it. And all this time that we were collecting signatures, that we were counting signatures, that we were out knocking doors, that there was just this, we felt guided in that. And the day that Denver voted, it actually looked like we lost. And when we went to bed that night, we didn't realize that there were 45,000 uncounted votes. And like I said, the initial numbers came in and it was like 48.5 or something. And we had an election watch party, and we were just all so convinced that it was going to happen, that when the numbers came back, that it didn't. There was just this collective, just like existential dilemma. Like, people were just so not ready to accept anything other than we were going to pass this. Everything just, all the pieces just seemed to orient in that direction. And like I said, when we went to sleep, we didn't know that there were still 45,000 uncounted votes. So the next day, a group of us were out to lunch, and we were talking about, okay, well, we didn't do it this time, but let's not let that kind of dissuade us from continuing the march. And it was just really, it was really sad. And it was the spring, and it had just rained for a few days, and I just had this weird feeling. I was like, in the spring, after it rains for a few days, mushrooms pop up, I just had this, I think I was quoted as having vicious optimism. And right before we found out, we actually found out at 4:20, and right before we found out, around 3 o'clock, I sat down and started doing the math around the early votes. And then the way Denver Elections does it is that every 45 minutes they update with the most current wave of counted votes. So when I sat down and looked at the trend, I realized that even the last 45,000 votes, even if the trend hadn't continued to go up, that we would still win. And I felt so confident at that point that we were going to win that I started calling everybody that was involved in leadership on the campaign. And I said, look, I did the math, and the math says we won. And at 4:20, maybe about an hour later, we actually got the official news that we had passed. And something that was really kind of crazy is that the media outlets that had been following us up to that point, when it looked like we lost, they said pretty much the most condescending things about us and how silly we were and better no luck next time. And then the next day when we found out that we had won, they had to make 2 articles, and the second article was affirming that we had won. So I really feel that it allowed the message to echo or ring out that much further. I'm trying to think, some key some key moments that were really interesting. One of the campaign people was in an Uber ride one day, and it turned out that her Uber driver was working, it was a high up in the Green Party in Colorado, and that's what led to our Green Party, what do they call that when they say this is a good campaign? Endorsement, yeah. And yeah, it just seemed like that there was this mysticism that followed the campaign, and in hindsight, the campaign was just very like psychedelic, very like it just manifested itself. And looking back, especially compared to the days when when Proposition 122 was running, it was just a much simpler time where everybody in the psychedelic space was oriented towards one goal. And I remember leading everybody on these really cool like vision exercises, and yeah, we just had people coming out of the woodwork that were willing to tell these stories of healing. And I had taken psychedelics for a long time, and I never recognized that they had true healing potential. And I would collect signatures, and I would hear story after story out of people that would, out of desperation, go to the mushroom, and it wound up being the exact thing that they needed to help them with a lot of really deep-seated trauma. And then one day I was collecting signatures, and somebody walked by me and scoffed and said, "Well, who gets arrested for mushrooms anyway?" And it reminded me that I had been arrested for mushrooms when I was about, I think I was 21 or 22. It was right after 9/11, and I was coming back into Pennsylvania from West Virginia through Maryland with some cannabis and some really fancy glass pipes. And because I was unwilling to cooperate with them, they chose to radiohead to the authorities in Pennsylvania. And the authorities in Pennsylvania, before I ever got out of custody in Maryland, went and served a warrant on my house. And I lived in a cottage on the back of a 40-acre estate, and I really had no reason to think that there would be law enforcement looking in the windows of my house, but they were. And because I had a bong visible, they were able to get entry into my house. And when they served this warrant, they looked under a bay window bench that I had constructed into a little incubator, and I had about 12 pint jars with a bunch of mycelium in it. And they took them and gave them to an FBI lab technician, and it took them about 3 weeks to produce mushrooms from my cultures. And then after 3 weeks, they charged me with criminal attempt to manufacture a controlled substance. So part of my origin story is that, yeah, these cultures got taken, and they, when they reported on it, they really sensationalized it. They stated that my little setup was generating $10,000 a month, that mushrooms were poison that would kill and had no therapeutic value. So it wasn't until that person had scoffed at me around who gets arrested for mushrooms that it even became an ingredient into my activism. And at that point, I recognized that a big part of my story was to prevent people from having to go through that trauma of getting arrested and having the news sensationalize what they were doing. So yeah, it really became fuel to my activist fire. At this point, I think it's a lot easier to run a mushroom campaign because the momentum is already there. Oftentimes think about my parents and how they feel about what I had done, and considering my history with mushrooms and getting in trouble. And after we passed the ordinance, my parents said to me, I don't know whether you've done a good thing or not. We don't think people should go to jail for this, but at the same time, we don't think everyone should have this. And now 4 years later, my mom calls to tell me that Anderson Cooper is talking to Prince Harry about this, about mushrooms, and you can tell that he knows what he's talking about. So within 4 years, I've already seen the cultural conversation evolve big time. So my bullet points for passing something similar would be a lot different today than they would have been 4 years ago, because, like I said, the momentum is already there. The science keeps supporting the fact that psilocybin is the least harmful substance out there, and also the fruitful studies just keep stacking up. So the first bullet point that I would recommend is that people get very up to date with the research that's happening. And now I think over 14 million people live in jurisdictions where psilocybin has either been decriminalized or legalized. And there's tons of evidence pointing to the fact that the sky hasn't fallen. And not only that, but there are really positive outcomes coming out of this. So the second bullet point is, I would say, get very familiar with the places that have already decriminalized and what has changed or what has not. In Denver, part of the ordinance is that we passed a psilocybin review panel, and they came out with a report last year that shows that there was no noticeable difference since we decriminalized psilocybin. The third thing that I would recommend, and this is something that was proved by an organization called Decriminalize Nature, is that if you go to the city council, if you go to the mayor, you can actually affect these changes at that level instead of having to take it to a vote. So the cost of running a campaign is extremely high compared to just having dedicated conversations with lawmakers that have already been elected. So that would be the third thing, is to kind of like get to know your local officials. And fourth bullet point, which I think is the most valuable for not only the law-changing process, but what comes after, and that is to find the others. One of Timothy Leary's less-known quotes is to find the others. And wouldn't you know it, that we have a lot more strength and we are a lot more resilient in numbers. So yeah, that becomes really important kind of like after the fact, is when you are trying to set up visible means and ways for people to come to the mushroom and be able to use it responsibly and meet others who have a lot more experience. Yeah, find the others. So if you poke around and you read about what reporters have said about the Decrim campaign, it's a very patriarchal version of kind of like what happened. And what I want to assure you is that it was a group of ragtag volunteers that perpetually asked the question, what can we do with what we have? And that's really what passed it, without too much drama. Yeah, that's the sentiment. So I feel like that is the story that should go out and about and empower individuals to get together and do this work.